Jaya Jashodanandana Jaya Braja Janaranjana Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Kunja Bihari Jaya Radha Madhava Jaya Radha Madhav Radha Madhav Radha Madhav Jaya Radha Madhav Jaya Radha Shama Sundar Radha Shama Sundar Radhe Prabhupada 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 Jaya Netai Gaur Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Hari Bol Netai Gaur Hari Bol 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 इतना सुंदर एक भजन गाना था यार लाइट गया है अभी तो ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय
Today we're continuing with the English reading of Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita, Chapter 3, a very nice saintly person. We're just at the point where Prabhupada's intimate friend, Narendranath Malik, is inviting Prabhupada to come and see a very saintly sadhu. Naren argued that he felt this particular sadhu was a very learned scholar, and that Abai should at least meet him and judge for himself. Abai wished that Naren would not behave this way, but finally he could no longer refuse his friend. Together they walked past the Parshnath Jain temple to one Ultadanga with its sign, Bhaktivinod Asan, announcing it to be the quarters of the Gaudiya Math. Now, this quarters of the Gaudiya Math, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he was born just 5 years after Mahatma Gandhi. So they were practically the same age. But his education was quite different because he had both types of education, both English and the Hindu culture. He was the greatest scholar in Sanskrit, astrology, and many other Vedic sciences. In fact, when he was attending the Sanskrit college in Calcutta, he had an argument with the principal of the college because the principal was he was applying Western astrology along with the Vedic astrology. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati didn't agree with that, so he left the college. And he was invited by the king of Tripura, who was a close friend of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, to come and be the head scholar there. So he went to Tripura, and not only that, he started a Sanskrit school and astrology school in Calcutta. So he was very successful on the material platform. He had full pension from Tripura. He also became the tutor of all of the princes of the king in Tripura. And he had everything that one could wish for on the material platform. Plus, he had the full access to the library of the king of Tripura. And in that library were all of the Vedic Shastras and all of the English books. But while reading the Gaudiya Vaishnav literature, he could not understand that although he had a perfect material lifestyle, as what was called in those days Bhadralok, a perfect Hindu gentleman, and although he fully accepted Gaudiya Vaishnava philosophy, he could not understand how the two could be coordinated in his lifetime. He couldn't see how he could apply Lord Chaitanya's teachings into a full lifestyle. So this dilemma grew in him, and he asked his father what to do. And his father recommended that he give up his position in Tripura, and he come to Mayapur and meet one Babaji named Gorkishore Das Babaji. And there, while meeting Gorkishore Das Babaji, who was illiterate, completely dedicated to chanting the holy names of the Lord, he realized that this life of the Bhadralok, the gentlemanly society of the Hindus, it has nothing to do with pure devotion. So he begged, on the advice of his father, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he begged for initiation, and in a very controversial manner, he received the holy name and the spiritual name of Barsabhanavi Devi Daita Das. And from the influence of his spiritual master, he began to chant Hare Krishna, and from the influence of his father encouraged him to preach Krishna consciousness. Now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur conceived that this Krishna consciousness is so important that it should be spread all over the world. And he encouraged his son, who we just heard about in the Hindi class, that this son was actually a gift from Lord Jagannath to Bhaktivinoda Thakur. Lord Jagannath had come in a dream to Bhaktivinoda Thakur and said, I haven't brought you to Puri to do this management work. I brought you here for another purpose, to preach. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he said, well, I'm old now, and I'm in my managerial post, so you please send someone from your own group to help me. And then Jagannath told Bhaktivinoda Thakur, you pray to Bimala Devi, and then you'll get that. So that son was born, and that was Bimala Prasad Datta. So this was the son that Bhaktivinoda Thakur had full faith would be able to carry out his conception of spreading Krishna consciousness all over the world. So that means that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he had two different people giving him two different instructions. One was to simply take shelter of the holy name, and Gorkishore Das Babaji called Calcutta the citadel of Maya, the kingdom of Maya. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, on the other hand, encouraged Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati to learn printing, to print books, and to preach in Calcutta. So first, in 1914, Bhaktivinoda Thakur disappeared. And that was a great loss for Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. A year later, his spiritual master disappeared. So then he was all alone. So for the next 10 years, he stayed in Mayapur and simply chanted Hare Krishna, begging the Supreme Lord to give him direction. What should he do in his life? After that, because he was also lecturing at that time, he was attracting young, intelligent students, he realized that the best thing to do is to follow the instructions of his father and take up this preaching mission. So this is at this time that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he decided to open up his first mutt in Calcutta. He left Mayapur and he had one disciple named Kunja Babu, Kunja Bihari. And Kunja Bihari was a postmaster. And he lived just near this Ultadangi lane, at Gori Badi lane. So they were looking together for where to get a place to start the ashram. And he found this 2-story house for 90 rupees a month. So then they moved in, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati named it after what Bhaktivinoda Thakur had called his ashrams, which was the Bhaktivinoda Asan. So then, within 2 years, because Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was doing extensive printing work, every day he would print a newspaper called Nadia Prakash. And every week he would print a pamphlet called the Gaudiya. And every month he would print in English and Sanskrit the Sajjana Toshani. So he was following exactly what his father wanted him to do by preaching through book distribution. So by that time, because the most popular of all of his publications was the Gaudiya, this Bhaktivinoda Asan became known as the Gaudiya Mutt. And underneath was a sign saying Bhaktivinoda Asan, headquarters of Gaudiya Mutt. So they used to send out their preachers to all of the gentlemen in Calcutta to invite them to their Bhaktivinoda Asan and to solicit donations. So because the Mulliks were very wealthy, Narendranath Mullik, who was a very intimate friend since childhood of Srila Prabhupada, he would give donations to that Bhaktivinoda Asan. And therefore, the devotees, the brahmacharis and the sannyasis knew him. And they invited him to come and meet Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. He had never met him yet. And because of the closeness of the two friends, he immediately went to Abai and he said, "You come with me. I want you to meet this saintly person. I hear that he's very scholarly." So finally, although Prabhupada, we had read last week, he had had enough with the sannyasis, with the sadhus. He had seen their real character, and he wasn't impressed. And he didn't feel any reason to go see another sadhu, because he had seen enough at his father's house. But because of Narendranath's intense pleading with him, "Now you come, I have to have your opinion." Finally, Prabhupada said, "Let's go." So, when they inquired at the door, a young man recognized Mr. Mullik. Narayan had previously given a donation and immediately escorted them up to the roof of the second floor and into the presence of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who was sitting and enjoying the early evening atmosphere with a few disciples and guests. Now, Kunja Babu, although he had taken the whole place on rent, he was paying all of that rent. I'm sorry, it was only 50 rupees a month. He was paying that 50 rupees from his salary as a postal clerk, as the postmaster. And it became too difficult for him. So what he did was he arranged that 3 families, Grihastha families, rent the ground floor. And the Mat be on the first floor, and then Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati stay on the roof. Now that whole building, after many, many years of negotiating, that whole building belongs to ISKCON Calcutta, and they had the grand opening. I think it was just this year. Beautiful grand opening. All of the rooms are completely refurbished, very nicely, very beautifully done. They've installed the deities again, Radha Govindaji and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and a beautiful deity of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati on the roof where he used to stay. They immediately escorted them up to the roof of the second floor and into the presence of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, who was sitting and enjoying the early evening atmosphere with a few disciples and guests. Sitting with his back very straight, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati appeared tall. He was slender, his arms were long, and his complexion was fair and golden. He wore round bifocals with simple frames. His nose was sharp, his forehead broad, and his expression was very scholarly, yet not at all timid. The vertical markings of Vaishnav tilak on his forehead were familiar to Abai, as were the simple sannyas robes that draped over his right shoulder, leaving the other shoulder and half his chest bare. Now, it so happens that after Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati received Diksha, he went traveling. He spent 1 year in Jagannath Puri, and then he went to the south because he wanted to carefully study the 2 Vaishnav Sampradayas, the Sri Sampradaya and the Madhav Sampradaya. Because the Gaudiya Vaishnav Sampradaya had fallen into the hands of debauched people. There were 13 Apasampradayas, including the Smarta Brahmins. There were the Attibadis, there were the Sahajiyas, and the educated people in Bengal had lost respect for Gaudiya Vaishnavism as a result of this. And because Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wanted to resurrect the real teachings of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he wanted to see how these Vaishnav Sampradayas were maintaining and growing in their communities. So he saw that they had sannyasis in their societies. The Gaudiya Vaishnavas had no sannyasis since Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. It had gone off into some Babaji and other type of things. So he realized after his father had left, after his spiritual master is left, he realized that he should take the sannyas order. But there were no sannyasis to give him that sannyas diksha. So he took a picture of his spiritual master, and he himself, through his spiritual master's picture, received the order of sannyas. And there's a beautiful picture just 2 days after he had taken sannyas. So, yes, Srila Prabhupada, he was familiar with the saffron robes and the tilak, but actually this is the first Gaudiya Vaishnav sannyasi since Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. A clean white Brahminical thread was looped around his neck and draped across his chest. Abai and Naran, having both been raised in Vaishnav families, immediately offered prostrated obeisances at the sight of the revered sannyasi. Now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, he was born in a Kayastha family. And that means Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was also of Kayastha caste. Now, How is it that he had a Brahmin thread? This was a big point of contention between the Smarta Brahmins in Navadvip and Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur, because according to the Smarta Brahmins, only born Brahmins are allowed to worship, especially Shalagram Shila. And there was a big conference in Midnapur. Bhaktivinoda Thakur was unable to attend because of poor health, so he asked Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati to attend on his behalf. And the first thing he did was he glorified the Brahmins. And then after getting there, they became confident that yes, they were so great. Then, according to Shastra, he proved that Vaishnavas are superior to Brahmins, and that anyone is eligible to become a Vaishnava. So then this became a cause of hatred, actually. Even Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati's life was in danger because he was crossing the Brahmins. Because Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he was the first to give diksha to non-Brahmins and even to women. That's why Srila Prabhupada also followed in that line and gave dikshas to mlechas, to yavanas, to anyone. Because according to Narada Muni and according to many slokas in the Srimad Bhagavatam and other shastras, anyone is eligible to become a Vaishnava. And a Vaishnava is superior to a Brahmin. So therefore, he had his Brahmin thread, although he was born in a caste family. He was worshipping deities. He was initiating and giving Brahmin Diksha also to his disciples. While the two young men were still rising and preparing to sit, before any preliminary formalities of conversation had begun, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta immediately said to them, "You are educated young men. Why don't you preach Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's message throughout the whole world?" Now, how is that? Because Gandhi and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they were contemporaries. And all over India at this time, there was huge hue and cry for Swaraj. They wanted the British out, and they wanted to have their own culture established within India again. And Srila Prabhupada at this time, he was a Gandhian. He also believed that first we have to have independence before we can establish our own culture. But at the same time that this Swaraj movement was going on, Bhaktivinoda Thakur and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they were pushing forward this pure Vaishnava philosophy because it had nothing to do with politics. Gandhi, he was very much in favor of removing untouchability. And he gave 10 questions that what is the source of this untouchability? Who is a real untouchable? Why the untouchables aren't permitted into the Hindu temples? He asked 10 questions. And Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he answered these questions according to the Shastra. He says the real untouchable is a person who does not worship Sri Vishnu. And anyone who does not worship the Supreme Lord, they are not allowed to come in and see the deity. So he saw everything according to Shastra. He also explained that this non-cooperation and non-violence, this is purely from the Shastra, but it's meant to be used in spiritual life, not in secular or political life. So he separated the two. He said, if you're taking the tenets of the Shastras, everything that you read has to be used in the service of the Lord. You can't take those same tenets and use them in material life. So in that way, he was using the pure philosophy of the Shastras to push forward Lord Chaitanya's movement. At the same time, Gandhi had taken those tenets and was trying to push forward politically. Prabhupada, he explained that whatever country you're in, Sarva Loka Maheshwaram, Krishna, he is the Maheshwara of the entire universe. So what is the use of this fighting? That I am in charge, or you are in charge? For how long can you be in charge? Because at the time of death, everything's finished. So you might be thinking, yes, this is my country, this is my desh, you get out of my country. And then at the time of death, if you're thinking my country, well, you might take birth as an Indian tree, or an Indian cow, or an American cow, because you're thinking your country. It's not your country. Everything belongs to Krishna. So in that way, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was purifying the entire philosophy that Gandhi was taking from the Vedas. So when Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, they hadn't even sat down yet, and he immediately said to them, this sentence, this is what changed Srila Prabhupada's life. Because although he was a nationalist, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was able to defeat him. Abai could hardly believe what he had just heard. They had not even exchanged views, yet this sadhu was telling them what they should do. Sitting face to face with Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Abai was gathering his wits and trying to gain a comprehensible impression. But this person had already told them to become preachers and go all over the world. Abai was immediately impressed, but he wasn't going to drop his intelligent skepticism. After all, there were assumptions in what the sadhu had said. We have to remember that Srila Prabhupada had studied philosophy in his college. And when you study philosophy, you learn how to defeat the different philosophers, just like the Munis. Every philosopher has to have his own philosophy. Every Muni has to have his own philosophy. And you have to be able to defeat them. So Prabhupada was skeptical. He had learned to be skeptical. He had learned to analyze everything very scientifically. Abai had already announced himself by his dress to be a follower of Gandhi, because he only wore khadi. So that was a statement. Anyone who wore khadi and didn't wear milk cloth, it meant that they were nationalists. And he felt the impulse to raise an argument. Yet as he continued to listen to Srila Bhaktisiddhanta speak, he also began to feel won over by the sadhu's strength of conviction. Because we have to remember, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he had passed through all of this earlier. He was fully convinced that the real purpose of life is to spread Lord Chaitanya's mission. And because Prabhupada, Abai, he was coming from a pure Vaishnava background, it was the first time he had ever heard someone speak like that. He could sense that Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati didn't care for anything but Lord Chaitanya, and that this was what made him great. This was why followers had gathered around him, and why Abai himself felt drawn, inspired, and humbled, and wanted to hear more. But he felt obliged to make an argument, to test the truth. In order to become a member of the Gaudiya Math, we have our daily sadhana. Our daily sadhana comes from the exact template that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati set up in all of his Gaudiya Maths. To rise early, attend Mangalarti, chant japa, attend Srimad Bhagavatam class, be engaged in service all throughout the day, then in the evening time, kirtan, arti, and more studies and classes. So this template of the sadhana in the temple was very strictly followed by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati and all of the students and disciples who studied under him. Prabhupada had never seen that before. He was very impressed. Drawn irresistibly into discussion, Abai spoke up in answer to the words Srila Bhaktisiddhanta had so tersely spoken in the first seconds of their meeting. Abai queried, "Who will hear your Chaitanya's message? We are a dependent country. First, India must become independent. How can we spread Indian culture if we are under British rule? Abai had not asked haughtily, just to be provocative, yet his question was clearly a challenge. If he were to take this sadhu's remark to them as a serious one, and there was nothing in Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's demeanor to indicate that he had not been serious, Abai felt compelled to question how he could propose such a thing while India was still dependent. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta replied in a quiet, deep voice that Krishna consciousness didn't have to wait for a change in Indian politics, nor was it dependent on who ruled. Krishna consciousness was so important, so exclusively important, that it could not wait. Now, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he was speaking directly from the Shastra. We know that Darwin, he claimed that evolution happens by selection, by the strongest, they are able to evolve more and more. But actually, this evolution comes from the Padma Purana, where it's described that there are 9 lakhs of living entities in the water, there are 20 lakhs of plants, the Stavara, and it goes on to describe the 8,400,000 species of life. So according to the Padma Purana, this evolutionary cycle takes millions and millions of years for every living entity to go through. Finally, when they come to the human birth, they have the opportunity to take to God consciousness. And that is why Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati said this could not wait. We've gone through millions of lifetimes, millions of years. Now in this human form of life, we have to take people out of this samsara and give them Krishna consciousness. It has nothing to do with so-called political parties, rulership, kingdoms, nothing. It is the eternal function of the soul, Nitya Krishna Das. And this is the platform that Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was speaking on. Abai was struck by his boldness. How could he say such a thing? The whole world of India, beyond this little Ultadanga rooftop, was in turmoil and seemed to support what Abai had said. Many famous leaders of Bengal, many saints, even Gandhi himself, men who were educated and spiritually minded, all might very well have asked this same question, challenging this sadhu's relevancy. And yet he was dismissing everything and everyone as if they were of no consequence. Yes, that's because Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, after taking full shelter of the holy name, he realized the real purpose of life, of this human life, is to become Krishna conscious and go back to Godhead. And he was not compromising in any way. And the way he did this was through yukta vairagya. He was not a false renouncer. He learned from his father to use everything in the service of the Lord to preach Krishna consciousness. And therefore he had the strength of all of Krishna's energies working with him to help the world become Krishna conscious. And he was convinced that it was possible. His father, he conceived this idea, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he put this idea into action. Although he couldn't see it fulfilled in his lifetime, he predicted that one of his disciples would take this Krishna consciousness and make the whole world Krishna conscious. And we know who that is and was. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati had articulated these ideas many times before in his writings. So this is a quote by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati. There has not been, there will not be, such benefactors of the highest merit as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and his devotees have been. The offer of other benefits is only a deception. It is rather a great harm, whereas the benefit done by him and his followers is the truest and greatest eternal benefit. This benefit is not for one particular country, causing mischief to another, but it benefits the whole universe. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he understood that by concept, by Shastra, and Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, he proved it. Because every country he went to, all over the world, people automatically were attracted to Krishna consciousness. And that was proof that the soul is eternally the servant of Krishna. It doesn't matter, according to one's previous karma, where one has taken birth. But the purpose of human life is to become Krishna conscious. The kindness that Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has shown to jivas absolves them eternally from all wants, from all inconveniences, and from all the distresses. That kindness does not produce any evil, and the jivas who have it will not be the victims of the evils of the world. So in concept and in preliminary action, it had come this far, from Mayapur to Calcutta. And then Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati gradually, he established 64 mutts, including 3 mutts outside of India. He sent one sannyasi to Burma, to Rangoon, and he sent 3 sannyasis to London, headed by Ban Maharaj. In London, Ban Maharaj was able to open a Gaudiya mission, and the Lord of Zetland, he established that. And we had heard that when Lord Zetland asked, "Can you make me a Brahmin?" And when Ban Maharaj said, "Yes, 4 things, you give up meat eating, you give up intoxication, you give up illicit sex, and you give up gambling." And Lord Zetland said, "It's impossible." So he didn't have much success in London, a few followers. Then he went to Berlin, and in Berlin he was able to convince 2 gentlemen to become disciples. He brought them back with him in 1935. So it was a very small beginning. But Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he was convinced that this Krishna consciousness was so important and so necessary for all the human beings that it could be spread all over the world. As Abai listened attentively to the arguments of Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he recalled a Bengali poet who had written that even less advanced civilizations like China and Japan were independent, and yet India labored under political oppression. We have to remember Srila Prabhupada in 1974, he went to Russia. Now, Prabhupada said that anyone born in Russia, it means that in order to take birth in Russia, it means that you never want to hear about God, because it was a completely communist country, and it was against the law to worship God. So Prabhupada, he believed that it was just the leaders who were evil, but the people were innocent. So he went there, he preached Krishna consciousness, he made his first disciple there, and despite all of the oppression of the government, thousands upon thousands of Russians became devotees. So that was proof that it has nothing to do with politics to become a devotee of the Supreme Lord. It is the natural constitution of every living entity to serve the Supreme Lord. Abai knew well the philosophy of nationalism, which stressed that Indian independence had to come first. An oppressed people was a reality. The British slaughter of innocent citizens was a reality, and independence would benefit people. Spiritual life was a luxury that could be afforded only after independence. Now, this is the concept of the Bhadralok at that time, that spiritual life and reading the Shastras and understanding Gaudiya Vaishnavism is just a luxury for the intelligentsia. But they didn't apply it to their life because they were influenced by the English to think that this is uncivilized religion. So therefore, it wasn't until Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was able to combine a real lifestyle with Gaudiya Vaishnavism that it became more than just a luxury. Because to live in his Bhaktivinoda Asana, that was not a luxury. It was rigorous monastic life. And therefore, he was showing by perfect example that Gaudiya Vaishnavism is a way of life. It is not just a luxury for some intelligent, wealthy Hindus to discuss in their homes. In the present times, the cause of national liberation from the British was the only relevant spiritual movement. It had nothing to do with spiritual. It was a purely political and secular movement. The people's cause was in itself God. So this is what was being stressed by Gandhi, and that was why he always carried the Bhagavad Gita. But we have to remember that Gandhi didn't like a fighting Krishna. He created his own Krishna. It's a fact, he said that. So he was trying to convince people that this was a spiritual movement to remove the British out of India, and this was actually what God wanted, and this movement itself was God, because he was also an impersonalist. But Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati was going to completely smash that. Yet because Abai had been raised a Vaishnava, he appreciated what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta was saying. Abai had already concluded that this was certainly not just another questionable sadhu, and he perceived the truth in what Srila Bhaktisiddhanta said. This sadhu wasn't concocting his own philosophy, and he wasn't simply proud or belligerent. Even though he spoke in a way that kicked out practically every other philosophy, he was speaking the eternal teachings of the Vedic literature and the sages, and Abai loved to hear it. Abai, of course, seeing his father, he said that his father, his first business was puja. Up until noon every day, he would just be worshiping. And then he would go to his shop at 1 o'clock, he would take a little rest, come home 10 o'clock at night, and then begin his worship again until midnight. So his real life was worship, but that wasn't a worship for preaching. That was a worship for his own internal and his family purification. Now Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he had the missionary spirit. So he wanted to turn everyone into Vaishnavas. And here we are sitting here because of his mercy. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, speaking sometimes in English and sometimes in Bengali, and sometimes quoting the Sanskrit verses of the Bhagavad Gita, spoke of Sri Krishna as the highest Vedic authority. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna had declared that a person should give up whatever duty he considers religious and surrender unto him, the personality of Godhead. Sarva dharmam parityaja mam ekam saranam braja. And the Srimad Bhagavatam confirmed the same thing. Dharma projita kaitavotra paramo nirmatsaranam satam. All other forms of religion are impure and should be thrown out, and only Bhagavad Dharma, performing one's duties to please the Supreme Lord, should remain. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's presentation was so cogent that anyone who accepted the Shastras, would have to accept his conclusion. So Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, of course we all have our daily sadhana, and that's the same for everyone within the Krishna consciousness movement. But there's also the Varnashram Dharma. Now, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati also, he accepted the Varnashram Dharma, he encouraged it, because that was created, Chaturvarnamayashristam, that was created for human society by Sri Krishna. And according to one's guna and karma, one has to work. So Srila Prabhupada, even at the end of his life, he said, my mission was only 50% complete, because now I want to institute this Varnashram Dharma within our society. We were all fully surrendered as much as we could be, but in order for society to run, just like a body, there has to be head, arms, belly, and legs. So Srila Prabhupada wanted to institute self-sufficient communities, and he was just starting that. There was the New Vrindavan community, there was the Gita Nagari community, and this was the next phase of Krishna consciousness. Now that he had thousands of followers all over the world, he wanted us to begin this Varnashram Dharma. So Sarva Dharmam Parityajya does not mean to give up Varnashram, because that's the structure for human society so that everyone can be elevated in their Krishna consciousness. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta's presentation was so cogent that anyone who accepted the Shastras would have to accept his conclusion. The people were now faithless, and Bhaktisiddhanta, said Bhaktisiddhanta, and therefore they no longer believed that devotional service could remove all anomalies, even on the political scene. Now, Srila Prabhupada, when he was going to get an interview with Indira Gandhi, he made some points, which you can see in Prabhupada's house, how even the political situation can become perfect by taking to devotional service. He wanted all the ministers to have kirtan every day. He wanted cow slaughter to be completely made illegal. He wanted prostitution to be illegal. All of those points, just like when Yudhisthira Maharaj and all of the saintly kings were the Raja Rishis, the society ran perfectly. Everyone was happy. Everything was flourishing. And when you read the Srimad Bhagavatam, there is the proof that devotional service is the cure for all political problems. So we had living experience of that in the times of Yudhisthira Maharaj and other great kings. He went on to criticize anyone who was ignorant of the soul and yet claimed to be a leader. He even cited names of contemporary leaders and pointed out their failures. He was very bold and very brave. He knew that in order to convince Abai, he spoke exactly about those leaders that Abai considered to be his. He said he used to worship Gandhi. So Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, he had to cut that, and he didn't mind using their names. And he emphasized the urgent need to render the highest good to humanity by educating people about the eternal soul and the soul's relation to Krishna and devotional service. So we're in the middle of this conversation between Prabhupada and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, and we'll continue next week, because this is the greatest turning point in Srila Prabhupada's life, and we should understand it according to how Prabhupada is seeing it, and also according to how Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati is seeing it, because he immediately recognized that this young man, educated young man who could speak English perfectly, he is the right person who can spread this Krishna consciousness all over the world. And it came to pass. Thank you. Hare Krishna. Jai. There are probably no questions, right? Okay. Hare Krishna.